or turn with me to Daniel chapter 4. Daniel chapter 4. We've been looking at the book of Daniel for the last few Sundays now. Actually, I guess last Sunday we did a VBS lesson, so that's not true of last week. But the ones before that, we have been studying from the book of Daniel. And we've been looking at some different characters throughout this book. One of them being King Nebuchadnezzar as kind of the chief character, at least in the first part of this book itself. And today will be no different. We're going to be looking at Daniel chapter 4. And we're going to be looking at a study that I think probably, if we're honest with ourselves, is a subject that affects each and every one of us, whether we're willing to admit it or not. And that is the subject of pride. We're going to be talking about looking at a lesson that's entitled Learning About Pride the Hard Way, which is what happened to King Nebuchadnezzar. It often happens to us too within this life. You know, when you ask the question, well, what is pride exactly? I don't know what the best definition for pride is. There's a number of things that come to my mind whenever I think about pride. Pride is the idea of where you glory in yourself, maybe glory in your own achievements, things that you're able to do, things that you're able to accomplish here upon this earth. The pride that the Bible condemns is really this idea of a self-sufficiency. You know, I can take care of myself. I don't need anybody's help. Certainly don't need God's help. But I can make my own way through life. And that sense of self-sufficiency, and you could also incorporate maybe a feeling of personal accomplishment. That's often what makes us proud within this life itself. Is one of the things that God condemns most in the Bible. In fact, I was thinking about the 7 things that God hates. Of course, one of them is a proud look. God hates pride. And He hates pride in anybody's heart, but especially within the heart of those who profess to be followers of Jesus. And so what is pride? Well, I think it would be attributing our success to our own thoughts, or our own words, or our own actions. In other words, this idea that we're who we are because of what we think and what we did and what we said. Everything that we've accomplished has been because of us, something that we have done. And that's basically, when you study King Nebuchadnezzar, that's basically the philosophy and the outlook that he had in life itself. Now, the idea of pride is not only prevalent, I think, in the way that we think about ourselves, but it can also be seen in the way that we respond to other people's success. You know, if other people experience success within this life and we're jealous and envious because of that, we almost feel like we've been cheated because we haven't achieved the same achievements that they've had in this life, or maybe we haven't got the same recognition, the same praise that they're getting when we're doing the same things. That's often a sign of pride within our lives too. Even people who probably would not consider themselves to be religious people in this world, they don't think highly of pride. They find pride offensive. And, you know, pride is something that you can easily detect in other people, but think about in your own life. Has there been a time when you've ever sat down and said, I'm too proud? You know, I'm full of pride. I think if we're honest, we'd probably say, you know, there's rarely, if any, been those times in our life when we've sat down and said, well, I'm just too proud of an individual. Now, I can see it over here in their life, you know, but just not present in mine. But if we let that pride go undetected, it's dangerous because it can change our eternal destiny. And so what we're going to read about today is some action that God took in the life of King Nebuchadnezzar that helped him see this pride and recognize it and change his life. Now, I want us to think about it as we go through this study, how God often does the same things in our lives. There are often events, there are often things that happen within our life where God allows us to look within our own hearts. And the reason that He does that is because He knows if we don't see that pride in our own hearts, we're never going to change, we're never going to make it to heaven. And so He exposes that pride in order to help transform us into the people that He wants us to be, and ultimately to help us get into heaven. Now, as you read about King Nebuchadnezzar, I think, again, I said pride is one of those things that's easily detected in other people. You can see a very proud individual. Nebuchadnezzar is proud to be the ruler of Babylon. He is proud that he is the king. He is the one who's in charge. And so the question becomes, how does God get Nebuchadnezzar to see that pride in his own life? What does he do to help him look within his own heart? And how can he change, or how did Nebuchadnezzar change whenever he was able to see that pride for himself? And so that's basically what our study this morning is going to revolve around. We're going to talk about pride. We're going to look at it from several different ways. The first thing that I want us to think about, though, is pride is not one of those easy things to get rid of. You know, there's a saying that we have in our society, and that is, old habits die hard. And basically what that means is, when you've been doing something a certain way for a long time, it's really hard to change. And you see that with pride in the life of King Nebuchadnezzar. Now, I want you to stop and to think back. There have been some events up to this point in chapter 4 that should have changed the way that Nebuchadnezzar viewed his life. It should have changed his value system. It should have changed his view of Jehovah God, this God of Israel. But it just, I don't know, just really hasn't materialized in the life that he's living here upon this earth. And why is that the case? Because when you do things a certain way for a long time, it's hard to change those ways regardless of who you are. And what you see, first of all, in this chapter, we're not going to look at the first 3 verses. We're going to save that, Lord willing, for tonight. But what you see is that when you often are able to accomplish great things, you become a proud person because of that. Pride often comes with great accomplishments. And so notice here in verse 4. Nebuchadnezzar says, Daniel 4 and verse 4, I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at rest in mine house and flourishing in my palace. So I want you to remember those things, those statements that he made there about his physical condition. And then in verse 5 he said, I saw a dream which made me afraid, and thoughts upon my bed and the visions of my head troubled me. We just got done a couple weeks ago studying the fiery furnace. And the question in my mind is this: how long of a time period are we talking about from the fiery furnace to where Nebuchadnezzar is here in Daniel chapter 4? Now remember, Nebuchadnezzar, historically we know he reigned for over 40 years. So basically we have an account of his 40-year reign and some things that happened in it in about 4 chapters in the book of Daniel, which isn't a lot of room. But some people believe it's as much as 20 to 30 years that have elapsed since the fiery furnace. And we know how we are as humans. You know, when time passes, we often forget the great lessons of the past. And maybe it's the case that Nebuchadnezzar has forgotten about this dream that Daniel had interpreted. Maybe he's forgotten about the lesson that he learned at the fiery furnace. But whatever be the case, here's what I do know for sure. He was enjoying a very peaceful time in his life. And he was prospering. Notice what he says there in verse 4. What was he doing? He wasn't out fighting wars. He wasn't out here defeating nations and kings like he had been doing in the previous part of his reign. He said, I was at rest in my house. And notice what he also says, I was flourishing in my palace. He was enjoying this time of great peace and prosperity. He had, at this point in his reign, I think he had defeated all of his major enemies. And so he kind of was able to sit back for a moment and maybe to relax and enjoy all the things that he had set out to accomplish. And one of the other things that impresses you when you study the history of Nebuchadnezzar, he was a guy who was known for his great building projects. The Ishtar Gates are one of the famous building projects of King Nebuchadnezzar. We actually had the brick of the gates glazed over, very immaculate for that day and age. You probably heard about the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Nebuchadnezzar built, or had those gardens built. He also built a replica of what most people believe, or restored it maybe, we're not really sure, of what was the Tower of Babel. And so he had all these great building projects. And imagine him. Here he is. He's sitting in his palace. He's in his own house. He's out here walking around. He's looking at his empire and he's saying, look at all this stuff. Look at what I've been able to do. Look what I've been able to accomplish with my own hands. And So again, we have to emphasize he's delighting in his own success. You know, he has this mindset that look what I did. Look who I am. You know, look what I've been able to accomplish in this life. You know what happened in the midst of his prideful thinking and all these great accomplishments that he has? God sends another dream into the thoughts of Nebuchadnezzar. Now it's interesting when we read about this dream, or at least when Nebuchadnezzar talks about it in verse 5, it's not exactly like the first dream that he experiences in Daniel chapter 1. In Daniel chapter 1, after he has this dream, remember the Bible says that he was troubled by this dream. He wasn't really sure, you know, what it was all about. He's a little bit upset about it, didn't really know. He was a little bit confused about it, didn't know what to make of it. But notice his speech about this dream in verse 5. He said, I saw a dream which made me afraid, literally terrified. Now, if you know, again, studying Nebuchadnezzar and studying his history, he was not a guy who was easily scared. But there was something in this dream, something about this dream that terrified Nebuchadnezzar. He wasn't just confused and upset about it like in Daniel 1. He was actually afraid whenever he received this dream. And so if you'll take just a moment and look at verses 10 through 17. I want to just take a moment and read through this dream so you'll know what I'm talking about as I go through it. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it or the interpretation of it, but hopefully you'll have some of the facts surrounding it so you can understand a little bit of the application and some of the things that transpired because of it. But notice in verse 10, Nebuchadnezzar says, Thus were the visions of my head in bed. I saw and behold a tree in the midst of the earth, and the height thereof was great. The tree grew and was strong, and the height thereof reached unto heaven, and the sight thereof to the end of all the earth. The leaves thereof were fair, and the fruit thereon much, and in it was meat for all. The beasts of the field had shadow under it, and the fowls of the heaven dwelt in the boughs of it, or boughs therefore, and all flesh was fed of it. I saw in the visions of my head upon my bed, and behold, a watcher and holy one came down from heaven. He cried aloud and said, Hew down the tree, and cut off his branches, shake off his leaves, and scatter his fruit. Let the beasts get away from under it, and the fowls from his branches. Nevertheless, leave the stump of his roots in the earth, even with a band of iron and brass, in the tender grass of the field, and let it be wet with the dew of heaven, and let his portion be with the beast in the grass of the earth. Let his heart be changed from a man's, and let a beast's heart be given unto him, and let 7 times pass over him. This matter is by decree of the watchers, and the demand by the word of the holy ones, to the intent that the living may know that the Most High ruleth in the kingdom of men, and giveth it to whomsoever he will, and setteth up over it the basis of men. Now again, I emphasize to you that what made Nebuchadnezzar so afraid about this dream? Well, I think again, you go back to Daniel chapter 1. He didn't remember the great statue that he saw. He didn't really understand much of it. But I think what Nebuchadnezzar saw in this dream, he's thinking, this is about me. You know? And in this dream, think about some things that he saw. He sees this great tree, this massive tree. It's providing all this fruit. It's providing all this shelter. And then somebody comes down from heaven and says, cut down the tree. And not only cut down the tree, but cut off the branches. And not only cut off its branches, but scatter its leaves all over the place. And make it a stump. And then give it the heart of a beast. I think in the mind of Nebuchadnezzar, he was thinking this is something about me. And when you cut a tree down, it's not a good thing, right? When you're the tree, at least. And so I think in his mind, he knows this is something about him, and this is something about his kingdom. And he's afraid. Remember, he's thinking about all these great accomplishments that he's made in life. He's afraid that he's going to lose everything. In a moment of time, all these things are going to be taken away from him. So he has this dream. And he's terrified about it. But it's interesting to me what happens. Because notice in verse 6, back up just a little bit. Here's what Nebuchadnezzar, chapter 4, it's kind of written from an autobiographical standpoint. But Nebuchadnezzar says, Therefore made I a decree to bring in all the wise men of Babylon before me, that they might make known unto me the interpretation of the dream. In verse 7 he says, "Then came in the magicians and the astrologers, the Chaldeans and the soothsayers, and I told the dream before them, but they did not make known unto me the interpretation thereof." I want you to stop there for just a moment and think about this. Had Nebuchadnezzar ever had a dream that nobody could interpret? Had he ever had trouble with the people, the wise men and the soothsayers and all these who's in Babylon not being able to understand and interpret a dream for him? Well, you got to think back to Daniel chapter 1, don't you? You got to think back to this situation where Daniel, this guy, came in. He told him the dream first. Nebuchadnezzar didn't even have to tell him what he dreamed, but he told him the dream, what he dreamed, and then he gave him the interpretation of, I don't know about you guys, but if I had another dream and I wanted to know the meaning of that dream, who's the first person you would call? I would call Daniel, wouldn't you? Because I know this guy can get it right. The question becomes this then, why did he call all these people of Babylon? Notice verse 8. He says, "But at last," at the very last, "Daniel came in to me, whose name was Belteshazzar, according to the name of my God, and in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. And before him I told the dream, saying," Why did Daniel come in last? Why didn't he have Daniel come in first? I think the answer is this. When you look at Nebuchadnezzar, he's a proud, proud man. Okay? And when you do things a certain way for a long time, it's really hard to change. First of all, I think it was hard for Nebuchadnezzar to ask for help. Secondly, it would have been hard to ask a Jew for help. Okay, this was not his own countrymen. This was not his own nation, his own pride and joy. This was an outcast. This was a guy who was a slave. The king has to ask a slave for help. And so I think in the mind, when you look at Nebuchadnezzar, he's just too proud to have to do that. He's going to try everything within his power to get an answer without having to ask anything of Daniel or a Jew again. And so think about this lifestyle of Nebuchadnezzar. You know, again, every time he accomplishes something, he feels this great sense of pride. He starts thinking highly of himself over and over and over again in his life. And whenever he really needs help, he just can't hardly bring himself to ask people for it. Now, the second thing that I want us to think about in this study is you have a lesson that needs repeating here. And it's an old lesson that has been presented to Nebuchadnezzar before, but he needs a little bit of reminding. And so what was the purpose? What was the purpose of this dream? What did God want to accomplish by it? I want you to focus on verse 17 with me there in Daniel chapter 4. It says, "This matter is by the decree of the watchers, and the demand by the word of the holy ones, to the intent," this is the whole purpose of it. This is God's intention with this dream. "To the intent that the living may know that the Most High ruleth in the kingdom of men, and giveth it to whomsoever he will, and setteth it up over it the basis of men." Now what we learn from this account here is God had a purpose in sending this dream. Now, it wasn't just some random thought that he placed within the mind of Nebuchadnezzar, but there was an intention that God had with this dream. There was a lesson that God wanted to be learned along with this dream. It's interesting to me, if you notice in the middle of verse 17, it didn't say "to the intent that Nebuchadnezzar may know," although he was certainly part of the purpose of that dream. God said "to the intent that the living." Who's that? That means everybody who's alive. God was trying to teach everybody who was alive a lesson through this dream and what would happen to Nebuchadnezzar. And what was the lesson that he was trying to teach? God was in charge. God rules in the kingdom of men. God puts in power whoever he wants in power. And so to think that you're king of Babylon because of something you did, God said, think again, Nebuchadnezzar. It has nothing to do with you. It has nothing to do with your thoughts. It has nothing to do with your words. It has nothing to do with your actions. It has everything to do with the fact that I'm in charge of this kingdom. And if I want the basest of men to be king, that's who's going to be king. That was the lesson that God was trying to teach everybody, not just Nebuchadnezzar, but everybody who was alive. Now, that's an important lesson. I wish I had a little bit more time to go into it in detail this morning, but it's a lesson I think that all of us need to be reminded of time and time again. The living and all the living need to remember that God is in control. Okay, it doesn't matter who sits on the throne. It doesn't matter who's president of the United States. It doesn't matter who's mayor of West Plains, Missouri. God is the one who's in control. And that's something that we as men often forget. And when we forget that fact, what we start doing is we start thinking that we're the one in charge. You know, the things happen to us because we're so strong or we're so smart. Or Nebuchadnezzar, you know, I did all these great things because of my intelligence and my power. And look at everything I was able to accomplish. And God says, you don't even understand. You couldn't accomplish one of those things if I didn't want you to. If I didn't allow it, if I didn't permit it. You're not in charge either. Now, what we learn from this, it's an old lesson, but God teaches it with a new instrument. The instrument that he uses to teach this old lesson with is Nebuchadnezzar. And there was a series of books, I guess they were actually sermon outlines that were written a long time ago by a preacher by the name of Franklin Camp. You might recognize that name. But they were entitled Old Truths and New Roads. He had 2 different volumes. But it's basically this idea or this concept. When you go to preach, you preach the same thing over and over again. The gospel, since it started 2,000 years ago, we're not preaching a new message. But you know what you have to do every once in a while? You have to change the way you present it. You have to put some new roads, a different twist, a different look on the very same lesson that has been taught since the beginning of time. That's what God's doing here. Just think how boring it would be if, when you read the Old Testament, you read the same story over and over and over again, teaching the very same lesson. But you know what God does? He teaches us the same lessons, but he does it with different people and with different instruments and different illustrations. And so it's really no different than adapting the message to the point in the presentation, I guess I should say, not the message itself, but the presentation of the message to the culture and the background. Sometimes you need a new take. And so here's God's new instrument that he's going to use to teach the same old lesson that he's been trying to teach man from the beginning of time. This is the intention that all the living may know that God rules in the kingdom of men. You know what I've learned over the years? I don't know about you, but I've learned that I'm a slow learner. That's what I've learned about myself. Sometimes you have to tell me something, then you have to tell me again, and then you have to repeat it again. But that's the art of learning and the value of repetition. You tell somebody the same thing you told them before, but you just tell them kind of in a different way. And that's what God was doing here with Nebuchadnezzar. Now notice why all these things happen. I'm not going to go through and read all these verses, but I do want to make mention to them, reference them. In verses 25 and verses 26, these things that were going to happen to Nebuchadnezzar, and we'll talk, maybe we'll have time to talk just a little bit about them so you get an idea. But in verse 25, it says, these things that were going to happen to him were going to happen to him till he knew that the Most High ruled in the kingdom of men and gave it to whomsoever he willed. In verse 26, he says, this is going to happen to you till you know that the heavens do rule. In verse 32, when Nebuchadnezzar hears a voice, when God's actual fulfillment of this dream and this judgment comes upon him, he hears a voice from heaven. And this voice from heaven says, these things are going to happen to you in the latter part of verse 32, until you know that the Most High ruleth in the kingdom of men and giveth it to whomsoever he will. When you go into Daniel chapter 5, as Daniel is standing before Nebuchadnezzar's grandson, he's recapping what happened to the great king Nebuchadnezzar. And in verse 21, he's talking about all these things that happened to him and how long they happened. He said, till he knew that the Most High God ruled in the kingdom of men and that he appointeth it over it whomsoever he will. Now here's what I want for us to think about. Most people, when you think about living in that place and at that time, most people, if you were to go to them and say, who's in charge? Most people would have believed Nebuchadnezzar was in charge, right? Most people would have believed that he was the one who, when he said something, it was going to happen. Now, it is true that he was king of Babylon. It is true that he could issue written decrees, and he did. Remember back in Daniel chapter 3, anybody who didn't worship the statue was going to die in a fiery furnace. That was a law, a decree that was written by Nebuchadnezzar. But here's what God wanted him to understand. It was the decrees of God that ruled, not Nebuchadnezzar. And that's what he showed him in the fiery furnace. Listen, you can write a law and you can make a decree, but if I don't want it to happen, it's not going to happen. You're not the one in charge. You're not the king that's ruling over everything, but I am. That was the message that God was trying to get across into his head. I think too often, pride allows us to think that we're the one who's in charge. You know, we're the one who's in control. And sometimes we think about, even the idea of the concept, people say, well, you control your own destiny. And it is true that in some sense, God allows the personal choices that we make to have an eternal outcome on our destiny. But you know who really controls our destiny? You know who in the end is going to determine what happens to us? It's not me, is it? It's God. God is the one who controls our destiny. Sometimes we think about this idea, well, I make my own path. I make my own way here upon this earth. Well, again, God allows us to make some personal choices and decisions that determine the direction that we go here upon this earth. But if God wants something to go a certain way, guess what? It's going that way. He can use the choices that we make, whether we make the good choices or the bad ones, he can use it to accomplish what he wants accomplished. But ultimately, God has determined our path here upon this earth. He determined before man was ever created where he was going to live, how far he was going to go. Read Acts chapter 17. Sometimes we have this idea, well, we hold the key to our own health in our hands. And there are things that we can do that can benefit us, physically speaking, in this life. But do you know why we're alive today? Not because of something we did, it's God, isn't it? God gives us life, God gives us body, God gives us health. All those things come back to this idea that God is the one in charge. God is the one who is in control. And we're allowed to make personal choices along the way, and God uses those choices. But if God doesn't make the decree, it doesn't matter what a man says, it's not going to be accomplished. That's the lesson of Nebuchadnezzar. And again, I think it's a great lesson for us because too many times we think, well, I'm the one in charge. Now, I'm the one in control. I'm the one who's going to determine this or I'm going to determine that. God is the king. And God is in control. And God is the one who makes the decrees and makes the decisions. And if he doesn't decree it and he doesn't decide it, it's not going to happen, regardless of what we do. And so the last thing that I want for us to think of, Nebuchadnezzar got what I would call a wake-up call. You know what a wake-up call is? You can go stay at a motel and you can say, call me at 8 o'clock and wake me up. Well, God sent him a wake-up call. We want to be sure that Nebuchadnezzar was aware of what was going on in his life. And so the way that he did that was through the fulfillment of this dream. Again, I wish I had some more time to go over the dream itself. I don't have a whole lot of time. Maybe I can mention it just briefly as we get toward the end here. We'll see how much time. But here's what I want for us to think about this morning. The personal application. Is pride present in us? Is pride present in you? You know, here's Nebuchadnezzar, and what he found out was his heart was full of pride. Notice in verse 22, Daniel's giving him the interpretation of the dream. He said, it is thou, O king. It's you, this tree that you're reading about. You are grown and become strong. Thy greatness is grown. And you reach unto heaven and thy dominion to the end of the earth. Just like Nebuchadnezzar probably was afraid of, that he was the tree. And what happened to that tree? Well, by God's decree, the tree was cut down. You see, Nebuchadnezzar had built this vast empire. It sheltered many people. It sheltered nations. That was representative of the animals that were under it. It was providing for almost the entire known world at that time. He was the ruler of this kingdom. He was the strong one. He was the one who was in charge. he was a king of a dominant and a strong kingdom. But you know why he was king of that kingdom? It wasn't because he'd done something great, or he'd said something great, or he thought of something great. It was because God wanted him to be king of that kingdom. And so the only reason Nebuchadnezzar had this kingdom, the only reason that he was in charge, because God had decreed that this was what was going to happen. If you read the fulfillment in verse 29 there of Daniel chapter 4, it says, at the end of 12 months, he walked in the palace of the kingdom of Babylon. The king spake and said, is not this great Babylon that I have built for the house of the kingdom by the might of my power and for the honor of my majesty? And while the word was in the king's mouth, there fell a voice from heaven, saying, O King Nebuchadnezzar, to thee it is spoken, the kingdom is departed from thee. You see, God waited a little while before he fulfilled this dream. But we'll talk about tonight, he did fulfill it. A year went by, and one day Nebuchadnezzar is out here and he's walking around and he said, didn't I do this? Didn't I build that over there? Isn't this my kingdom? Isn't all this that I see and enjoy because of me and my personal accomplishments? Well, he should have learned from that first dream there in Daniel chapter 1 that the kingdom and the king of Babylon would come and go. Remember the world empires? That's what we studied on that Sunday night lesson. The kingdoms of earth come and go. Earthly kings rise up, earthly kings end. But the real king and the real kingdom is going to last forever. That was the message of Daniel chapter 1. God is the real king. His kingdom is the real kingdom. It's eternal in nature. And so he should have learned from that dream. You go to Daniel chapter 3 when he witnesses the miracle of these 3 Hebrew youths. And he made this decree that anybody who doesn't worship this statue is going to die in the fiery furnace. But you know what he should have learned from that? He should have learned that no one can defy the real king. That's God. God is in charge. What he should have learned is, hey, I'm not really the one in charge. I'm not really the real king of all of these things. I'm not the one who really makes the decrees that are going to be observed or not. So you have this lesson over and over again. Daniel said, you're the tree, Nebuchadnezzar. You're the one who's proud. You're the one who's lifted up. And so I want us to think about that question this morning. Do you know what happened to Nebuchadnezzar because he was full of pride? He was acting like an animal. And here's basically what God tells him in verse 21. It says, he was driven from the sons of men. This is actually Daniel chapter 5, where Daniel is telling Nebuchadnezzar's grandson what happened to him. But he said he was driven from the sons of men, and his heart was made like beasts, animals. And his dwelling place was with the wild donkeys. They fed him with grass like oxen, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, till he knew that the Most High God ruled in the kingdom of men, and that he appointeth it over whomsoever he willed. The cutting down of that tree in that dream that Nebuchadnezzar had symbolized he was going to be removed from off his throne. God was taking him off the throne. What was left was a stump. You know what that stump represented? It represented hope. It represented that one day this tree could start regrowing. It was still there. There was still hope. It wasn't completely dead. One day it could come back. And that's exactly what God did to Nebuchadnezzar. 7 times. Some people think that means 7 years. I don't know the extent, the physical extent of the time frame. But here's what I do know. During that 7 times, Nebuchadnezzar lived and acted like an animal. You'll read about how Daniel talked about there in verse 21. He would eat grass, just like an animal eats grass. He would feel the forces of nature upon his body. He would go out and live in a wide open field, just like an animal did. And here's the lesson that God was trying to teach him. If you want to think like an animal thinks, if you want to think you're in charge and think that you're the one making all the decisions, then you're going to be one. You're going to live like an animal lives. Until you understand that I'm the one who's in charge. There's a lot of good verses in the Bible that talk about the stubbornness of animals. In Psalm 32 and verse 9, it Psalmist said, "Be ye not as a horse or as the mule, which have no understanding." I always laugh when I read these verses because, from personal experience, have you ever been frustrated by an animal? Have you ever gone out to work cattle or something and you say, "I'm in charge. This is the way you're going to go. This is what you're going to do. This is what I want from you." And the dumb animal thinks they're the one in charge, don't they? You know what they do? They turn around and they run exactly away from the direction that you want them to go. They don't do what you want them to do. They don't understand that you're the one who's in charge. And you know what that does to us? To me, it infuriates me. Okay? Makes me angry. Makes me frustrated. Because this dumb beast doesn't know that I'm the one who's in charge. They think they are. They think they're going to do whatever they want. Well, in the end, hopefully we accomplish our will, right? That's what we're trying to impose. But the animal is rebellious. It's self-willed. It's headstrong. What would it do if it were smart? It would do what you wanted it to do. That's the lesson. Nebuchadnezzar was this animal. He was this stubborn, rebellious, self-willed animal that he was the one who was in charge. He was the one who was going to do whatever he wanted to do. It didn't matter what his master, God, told him to do. He was the one who was going to be in charge. And God says you're going to learn the lesson sooner or later, just like the animal. You're not in charge. You may think you are. You may try to act like you are. But you're not the one who's really in control. What we have to understand in this world is we're only the subjects. God is the one who is king. Remember what Jesus told Saul in Acts chapter 9 and verse 5? He asked the question and he heard the voice from heaven. He says, "Who are you, Lord?" He said, "Of course, I'm Jesus whom you're persecuting. It's hard for you to kick against the pricks." You know what he was talking about there? He was talking about the idea of an animal where you take an ox and you harness that ox up, and what you had is you had a sharp stick or a goad. And when you wanted that animal to go, you would poke it. And if that animal didn't do what you wanted it to do, you'd poke it again. And you know what sometimes animals do when you poke them? They try to kick you. And you know what happens to them? They're just going to kick that sharp stick in farther and farther in their skin, aren't they? They're going to hurt themselves by kicking at their master. That's what Jesus was talking about. Here was Saul out here, stubborn, rebellious, self-willed. You're trying to kick against my will. You're only going to hurt yourself. And in the end, as humans in God's kingdom, when we try to rebel, when we try to be self-willed, when we try to be the one who's in charge, you know who we're hurting? We're not hurting God. God's still in control. We're just hurting ourselves. It took 7 times for Nebuchadnezzar to learn that lesson. But he did learn it. The first thing that he does when he learns it is he praises God. And the second thing that he does is he acknowledges the sovereignty of God. I want you to look at verse 35. He writes this decree. He sends it over all of his kingdom. And here's what he wants them to know. He says, all the inhabitants of the earth are reputed as nothing. And he, that is Jehovah God, doeth according to his will in the army of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth, and none can stay his hand or say unto him, what doest thou? You know what Nebuchadnezzar learned? He learned that God, Jehovah God, was in charge of everything that went on in heaven and in earth. He learned that there was nothing that anybody could ever do to defeat his kingdom or to defeat him. God's record is undefeated, and it's always going to be. It's 7 years or 7 times before Nebuchadnezzar considered, you go back 7 years or 7 times before Nebuchadnezzar thought about himself as a great man. He thought about he had built this great kingdom, but now he had a different viewpoint on life. You know what that was? He said, people are nothing. People don't accomplish anything. But God is the one who is everything. And God is the one who's in charge. My lesson, or our lesson this morning, is don't be too proud to learn that in life. Too many times we're like the animal. We think we're the one in charge. We think we're the one who's going to control our own destiny. But you know the lesson that we're going to learn in the end, and it's a lesson that God has taught us over and over and over again throughout the Scripture. It's got new instruments when he teaches these lessons, But in the end, God is in control. And God is going to make all the decisions and all the decrees, and there's not one single thing that we can do about it. Don't be too proud to change. You see that at Nebuchadnezzar in the beginning of his dream. Too proud to ask for help. Pride will make it shy away from needing anybody's help, including God. There's too many proud people in the world today. They're not willing to admit they need a Savior. They're not willing to admit that they need somebody in charge, somebody higher than they are. Lessons those taught over and over again in God's Word. One teacher told me the 3 keys of learning are repetition, repetition, repetition. And there's a lot of truth in that. You got to hear something over and over and over again until you learn it. Nebuchadnezzar finally learned it. And then let's think about the wake-up call. Look at ourselves personally. Is there pride in our life? Do we think we're in charge? Are we being like the animal? We're stubborn. We're self-willed. We're trying to fight our master, trying to keep from doing what he wants us to do. We need to quit acting like animals. We need to quit thinking like we're the one who's in charge. We need to learn that great lesson that Nebuchadnezzar learned. God rules in heaven and earth. And whatever he says is what's going to happen. You know, you have the opportunity this morning, if you're not